Greetings with lovers everywhere. I'm Etran and welcome to Eat Train Talks. And here I talk everything books in the hopes of inspiring others to love reading as much as I do. And I'm so excited about today's guest because she is an award-winning author of two nonfiction middle grade reads, which is exciting because I don't really get the chance to talk to too many nonfiction middle grade writers. And in case you didn't know, I am a huge history and trivia fan, so this is going to be a special treat for you and for me. So our guest writes award-winning stories about secret code breakers and explorers competing to make it to the bottom of the earth. Her stories are fascinating and riveting, and they make you want to learn history, and they make you also love history. So if you haven't figured it out yet, I am speaking to the very, very talented author, Rebecca E.F. Barone. Thanks so much for joining me today, Rebecca.
Hey, thanks so much, E-Train. I love this. I love your podcast, and I love that you interview authors and bring literacy to so many kids your age, and that's wonderful.
Well, thank you so much, Rebecca. And your books, they not like what I love about nonfiction is that they not only, well, they're in addition to the beautiful world of middle grade, but they also educate readers as well and teach them about topics that many people wouldn't really second guess because like for instance, with the code breakers in Unbreakable, which we'll talk more about, nobody really remembers or really understands just how important it was to break the enigma. So we'll definitely talk
Mhm.
more about that later in the interview. And for those who don't know, Rebecca has received a lot of high praise, and she certainly deserves it for her books. And some of them include, at least for Unbreakable, the ALA Booklist Editor's Choice Award, and also the Chicago Public Library Best Informational Books for Older Readers of 2022. That is a long title. And her writing has even been recognized as an age 9 to 12 best children's book on Amazon. So let's get right into the questions because I know we have a lot to talk about.
Yes, I can't wait.
I can't wait either. And now, my first question for you is about
Mhm.
Unbreakable. So I was first introduced to your writing when I read Unbreakable, or more specifically when I met you on MG Book Chat, which is a Twitter chat where all the amazing authors and middle grade readers and lots more, librarians and teachers too, we all get together and talk about our favorite books. And
Mhm.
Unbreakable was one that I discovered, and it is such an important and interesting read about the race to break the Nazis' Enigma code. It's a really important piece of history, but it's not really talked about much because, well, I don't even know because it basically changed the course of World War II, and the war would have lasted a lot longer and would have been a lot more severe if the amazing code breakers back then hadn't discovered the Enigma code, I guess. So the fact is, if the Nazi code wasn't broken, the war could have ended very differently and very badly. So, two questions in one. Without giving away any spoilers, can you share what the code breakers were and who they were, and how the war and the world that we live in now could really look differently, how it would look if the Enigma code wasn't broken?
Yeah, no, I think you make a really good point there. So Enigma was central to winning for the Allies winning World War II. I don't want to give, like you said, I don't want to give too much away, but there's this great quote, I think in the epilogue, where one of the code breakers goes back and calculates after the war that because of breaking Enigma, because of breaking this code, the war was shortened by something like 3 years, which is just
Wow.
staggering when you think about the lives that were impacted and would have been impacted if the war kept going on. So let's see here. Unbreakable is the story of breaking the Enigma code. So the Enigma code is actually two things. It's the code, or it's the method by which the Germans' message was
Mhm.
coded into gibberish, and it's also the machine. So they actually did this by typing normal German words into a machine and then getting the coded words out. So the code is the Enigma code, and the machine is the Enigma machine. And so the code breakers are the people who, try and understand the machine and try and understand the code. And this is very, very different than anything really that has been going on into code breaking before this. So I start off the book by saying it's really the Polish code breakers who start about 10 years before the war. Everyone can kind of see that the World War II is probably going to happen, even though they don't know the form. They don't, they certainly don't know it's going to be World War or anything like that. But the Polish codebreakers can see that they need to get inside German intelligence. And so all of this German intelligence, all of these messages, their strategy, their plans, their armaments, everything's being just given out over the radio. Anyone, it's like tuning a radio station. Like you tune a radio station, anyone could listen in, but it didn't matter who was listening in because no one could understand the messages.
Yeah.
And so the Polish code breakers realized we have to break this code. We have to understand all of this information that we have just sitting here in stacks and stacks and stacks, but we can't read. Um, so they were the first ones, and then once the war started, the book really follows those code breakers as they're pursued across the continent by the Nazis. So a lot of their story is very dramatic, very action filled, running away, and how do they do that, and do they make it, and how will they make it if they do. So at that point, the story kind of the code breaking story gets handed off to, and then here's where you might start knowing names because the code break story gets handed off to the code breakers at Bletchley Park in England. And this is how I found out about the story with Alan Turing, who is a very famous
Mhm.
English code breaker. And he kind of comes into the picture, and a lot of other code breakers come into the picture. Ian Fleming, who would later write James Bond, gets involved. And so the story kind of just picks up from there.
So a lot of nonfiction are kind of retelling, and you do that in Unbreakable and Race to the Bottom of the Earth, but you also add that aspect of a story because
Mhm.
as we're following along Alan Turing and all the other code breakers who might not be as famous, they there are mysteries surrounding it, adventure. It's just an action-packed story, but you wouldn't really think of an action-packed story as one that's nonfiction. And you
No, and
mentioned
especially because, oh, sorry, go on.
that you can go ahead.
Well, and especially because I pitched this story to my editor. My editor and I, same editor that I worked with, Race to the Bottom of the Earth. And so we were kind of talking about this, and I was like, and it's going to be about math. And I could just over the phone hear his face kind of fall. I'm like, oh, darn. And it's like, no, no, no. But I want it to be interesting. I want it to be good. And so that was one of the challenges, of course, because so much of this code breaking really is math, and it's really hard math and really complex math. And I have a pretty good background in math, and whoo-wee, that just went right above my head. I mean, like it's stuff that I really don't even understand. I can't even follow, much less create with. But the point was always with both books, it wasn't so much with history. I'm not really a history buff, but I love stories. I absolutely love stories, and I love nonfiction stories, and I love fiction stories, but I love it when it gets into the emotion of there. And I keep calling them characters, but they're really people. But what are these characters feeling? What are these people feeling? And who are they? And why are they motivated? And who are they interacting with? And so they become characters like any fiction story, even though everything is true. And that's one of the things I really have to, say over and over with this book is that there's dialogue in it. And everything, all the quotes are absolutely true. I mean, everything in the book. If I say someone's wearing a red shirt, it's because I have sources that on that day say that person was wearing a red shirt. So hopefully it is told like a story, and then, like a novel, even though it's nonfiction. And that's certainly the goal, and that was the driving force behind this. But everything in there is absolutely true. And there's this great author that writes, I think, only for adult audiences. So you might have a couple of years before you get to him. But Bill Bryson writes about language, and he writes memoirs. And he's written two sciencey nonfiction books. And in his opening to his first science nonfiction book, he goes on, and just to paraphrase a quote, he says at some point as a kid he stopped being interested in science because the textbooks were so boring. And he
Mhm.
said he grew up with this like sneaking suspicion that science didn't have to be boring, that there was actually really good stuff in there, that the world was really interesting, but it was boring the way it was presented. And so I read that for the first time, and it really hit me, and it really struck with me because I think that science is not at all boring and math is not at all boring, but a lot of the times the way it's told is boring. And to tell it like a story, and to tell these amazing, true um, things that actually happen, but to tell it in a way that it becomes like a story. That's really what's driving me to write both books, write my books.
Well, speaking of writing both books, you actually have a third book coming out soon, and which I'm very excited for. It is about the eruption of Mount St. Helens, and my dad actually
Mhm.
lived in Washington State when the eruption occurred. So we've talked a bit about it, but I'm really excited to read a story about it. It is called Mountain of Fire: The Eruption and Survivors of Mount St. Helens. Like Mountain of Fire, that's
Mhm.
already an, I guess, captivating title. And sadly, we have to wait until spring of 2024, which is about a year from now. But I know that the book will certainly be worth the wait. So can you share a little bit about Mountain of Fire and the research that kind of went into it?
Oh, absolutely. And it's amazing. I probably should have been able to guess this, but each of my books have gone through such a different research process that I was really startled by that. Race to the Bottom of the Earth, the first race is in 1912. And so certainly I'm just using, journals and stuff from that. And then Unbreakable has some recordings you can get, and there's some things that like people are recreating the Enigma machine and recreating the bomb and stuff like that now. So you have a little bit more to go on. But then you get to something like Mount St. Helens, or the eruption of Mount St. Helens, which took place in 1980. And those people are still alive. I mean, like your dad. And, that was a little bit before my time, but even still, like most of the people who were involved with that are still around. And so this was really the first book. Mountain of Fire was the first book where I was able to like interview a bunch of the characters or a bunch of the people that really appear in the book and get their firsthand accounts and not have to rely on someone else and what someone else was taking and transcribing from them. And so that was incredible. There was video of the time. There were pictures that were taken, and not just grainy pictures like we have for Unbreakable from World War II, but color pictures,
Yeah.
and pictures that were taken like as the mountain was, as the volcano was erupting. And so there's just this wealth of information, and continuing to the present day. So the research was really different, and I'm thrilled to be able to talk to so many people. And that was, I think, going to really make the book. I'm really excited for the book, and I think it really makes the book just come alive in a whole new way.
Well, now after that brief introduction into the story, I cannot wait to read Mountain of Fire. Fire, fire. I mean, that title, it just sticks with you, and it really, because Mount St. Helens was such an astounding, I guess, eruption, because it was kind of shocking. It hadn't erupted in so long, and there's still everlasting effects of the eruption even now because it was just 40 years ago.
40 years
Yeah.
ago. Yeah. Yeah. Just a little over 40
And
years ago. And absolutely, like you said, the effects are still being felt to this day. The landscape is still totally different than it was 40 years ago. It's kind of, it's coming back and everything like that. And I spend maybe the last, I don't know, 20% of the book saying how the area has really revived itself and come back from this just absolute desolation and devastation that was immediately after the eruption. And so watching that come back and how that's come back and how people have actually really stepped back. And one of the major takeaways from the book, that I guess this is a little bit of a spoiler, but one of the major takeaways is that nature does best when really left to itself. That like a lot of the human interventions where we tried to come back and help the mountain, it
yeah,
actually didn't work. And in the places where you just left it alone and stepped back and let nature do its thing, really works the best.
really does.
But yeah, it was the first volcano to erupt on the continental 48, I think, since any type of modern scientific equipment had been invented. So they're really, before this, they were working off just like legends and what traces they could find of previous ash and previous eruption that were in the rock. The ash and pumice get crushed down and get into this layers of the soil and the rock, and so they could find some traces from that. But a lot of the story is the disconnect between those legends and that history and what's actually going to happen, and how they try and jump that gap, and how they react to the eruption once it's going on.
Well, you talked a lot about the science and behind that. And speaking of science, you certainly have a background in science because through your website, I discovered that you have a really diverse background, meaning like you're kind of a jack of all trades in a sense. You did injury analysis for the NFL, like talking about like turf toe, which is a
Hmm.
pretty
Hmm.
interesting injury. And you also have a background in engineering. And Something that I found pretty surprising and impressive is that you also helped develop hybrid vehicles, among
Hmm.
many other things. But now you're writing novels for middle graders, nonfiction novels at that. So, what prompted you to really pursue writing?
Yeah, so when I do school visits, what I usually do is open it up by talking about engineering and saying that I've had these, different experiences. And I got out of college, I became an engineer and went to school and became an engineer and went back home. I'm from Michigan, and so worked for Chrysler and worked on hybrid cars. And I tell all about how well cars work for us, and I'm in Ohio now, and cars work for you, and you're in California, right? And we know all this because we take the cars out and we do all this testing on them. And we test the cars in California, we test the cars in Ohio, and we also test them in the coldest parts of the US, in Bemidji, Minnesota, and then we put them in a cold chamber in Bemidji in the middle of winter and take it down to minus 40 and try and break the car. And then you do the opposite thing and you take it to Death Valley and you try and break the car in, June in Death Valley. And you do. And that's also that the car works when it gets to the consumer. You want the engineer to break it. And so I talk about too, how cars and humans really aren't that different, and car doors open, and your finger is like a hinge and your knees are like hinges. And so athletes break the same way that cars can break. And so it's kind of all part of the same story. And as I talk about this, we kind of, the students and I that I'm talking to kind of end up realizing that there are characters, and sometimes the characters are cars, and sometimes the characters are football players, and sometimes the characters are engineers, and there's always conflict, there's always things breaking. And so it's really, engineering is amazingly a story, just like we were talking about science being a story before. Engineering is just like the same type of story, and it's often told in a different language. It's often told in math, which makes it a little bit obtuse, which makes it a little bit hard to understand the story, and you need to get used to translating that story. But otherwise, it wasn't very different for me, because the other thing is that once you discover something as an engineer, it does no one any good if it stays in your own head. If that information just sticks with me, that's not going to help the cars, that's not going to help the football players, that's not going to help anybody. And so I was really surprised as an engineer how much writing I had to do. So you write these papers, you give presentations, you're always writing reports and stuff like that, because if it's just you and you're the only person to have the information, it doesn't do the world any good. So between this idea that I was really looking at the engineering projects as a story, and then I was already writing about them, to other engineers, it really wasn't that big of a jump for me to say, oh, well, there are other cool stories out there, and I want to write about them. And I started writing so much as an engineer that I got to the point where I was enjoying writing and like seeing my reports and everything published more than I was enjoying doing the engineering. So that was kind of the jump that I had to make from between my own projects and my own research to telling someone else's story. But other than that, I don't think it's very different. And I think that looking at engineering and looking at math and science as if it were telling a story, I think that's a really good way to do it. And I think that a lot of students that maybe get confused, and I am an engineer and I do understand math, but I had to work very hard at it. And I think had I realized earlier on that what I was doing was just telling the story of two crashing into two, and there's an explosion and out pops four because they've combined and and made this new thing. I think for me, thinking about like that earlier on would have helped a lot. And so, that's not the goal of writing the books. But I do hope that maybe some readers out there can understand that the math isn't quite as scary, and the science of it isn't quite as scary, because we can look at it like these other things, like other novels that we're used to reading, and those aren't scary, those are enjoyable. Um, so that's a longer answer to how I made the jump from engineering. But I don't think that engineering and books are all that different, even though they're often presented like they are.
So, my next question for you is about Race to the Bottom of the Earth, but it's not necessarily
Mhm.
about the book in a sense, rather, I guess, Antarctica. So,
Yeah.
the Race to the Bottom of the Earth took place in 1912, as you said, and
Mhm.
the kind of the at least the main person is Captain Falcon Scott, and
Mhm.
so you're kind of an expert. I mean, you did write a whole book about the Race to the Bottom of the Earth, which is, I guess, the race to Antarctica. So,
Mhm.
I'm really curious to know, as an expert, do you have any thoughts on the conspiracy, or maybe even the fact that it could be a reality, that Antarctica will be fought over in the future for precious resources like oil? And do you really think that Antarctica has these resources and will alter the world in a huge way?
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, E-Train, I'm so impressed by your questions. Like this is
Thank
such an
you.
insightful question, and you do so much research to prepare for your talks. It's incredible, and it's really fun to engage with.
Thank you.
So I think that's a great question. I don't know that I consider myself an expert about Antarctica, but I do love thinking about it, and I did spend quite a bit of time with it. I think so. The Antarctic treaty system is absolutely incredible. There's something like I forget how many countries, but there are all these countries that come together that have signed this treaty, this series of treaties agreeing how they're going to act in Antarctica. We keep talking about, Race to the Bottom of the Earth in 1912. And what a lot of that race was done with with humans, of course, but they also, both teams relied on dogs and to some extent ponies. And the fact of the matter is, we could never do that race today because animals aren't allowed on Antarctica because of that treaty system. And Antarctica, the very South Pole, doesn't have a time zone because it's at the very bottom of the earth. So it's kind of all the time zones, right? So anyone who's down there to do research or explore or anything uses the time zone that they left from. So if you left for Antarctica from Australia, you'd stay on an Australian time zone. If you left from Argentina, you'd stay on an Argentinian time zone. Um, so all of that means you could be on one time and the person in the room next to you could be on a totally different time zone. And that's a little thing, but that takes such cooperation. I know you and I had a time zone thing just
Yeah.
getting on the Zoom, and that's one Zoom and we're what, 2, 3 time zones away from each other. So I think what I've been most impressed with in terms of Antarctica is the cooperation. And that's not to say things can't change or things won't change. Um, but I think what I'm most left with is hope. Um, Hope that explorers and researchers can continue. That has gone you know, so far so well, and there's quite a lot of reason to be hopeful that they can continue like this. So maybe that's being overly optimistic, but it's awfully impressive on a range of um, on a range of issues. So I'm quite hopeful going forward that Antarctica will still be a place of cooperation, and a place where people can work to agree. As hard as that can be, they can work to agree on things.
How do you go about researching your books? Now, you mentioned earlier that each book's research process is pretty different because, well, Race to the Bottom of the Earth, 1912, Unbreakable, the
Mhm.
late 1930s to 1940s, and then Mount St. Helens, 1984. So,
Yeah.
how do you, I guess, maybe like generalize or vaguely say, what do you mainly do, I guess, when you research? Like, do you look to
Mhm.
textbooks or other novels, or do you scour the internet?
Yeah. Yeah. And then thrown into there too is that the pandemic landed smack dab, I think, in the
Mm,
middle of Unbreakable. So Race to the Bottom of the Earth, I had done most of the research before the pandemic. I think maybe I was drafting, I forget exactly where. Most of Race to the Bottom of the Earth was done. Unbreakable, though, was my pandemic book. And just the idea of how I'm sure everyone remembers how
yeah.
shut down the world was for that. So that added quite a bit of complication. I have deep debts of gratitude to librarians, especially for Unbreakable. I use the library like crazy. And here in Ohio, we have a wonderful library system where, as long as you're a resident of Ohio, you can get a library card to any library in the state, which
Wow.
is wonderful. Yeah, so which is wonderful. So during Unbreakable, there were some books that were, in the reference section of the Cincinnati Library that I couldn't get to. They were off limits to me, and I had wonderful librarians just scanning in, the pages that I needed to reference, and just saying, if you need anything else, please come ask. And so all these librarians, and really all over the world, I had to go all over the world in terms of research and reaching out to people for these different books. Um, so librarians just have this, thank you so very much, because I would not be able to do my job without them doing it so wonderfully well. um, I think always first person, anytime I can relate to a subject, be it a character or a machine like Enigma, firsthand, that's always best, and I think that's always what I would go to. But unfortunately, a lot of the time that doesn't happen. Either the person is no longer with us, or there's a pandemic, or any number of reasons. um, but I use books heavily, I use the library heavily. The internet is great for things like videos that have the sound of Enigma, because I couldn't actually physically visit an Enigma machine, but I could listen to one being typed on, and I could watch how people were typing on it. So those type of secondhand experiences that really make it come alive, where I can um, not be there myself, but be as close to it as possible. So I don't know that there's really one way that I research it, but libraries are a big part of it. Books are a big part of it. Interviews, if I can have them, and definitely the internet makes my job possible.
Well, my next question for you is, well, I know you've written a lot about a lot of different topics from a lot of different time periods, but is there one historical event that you haven't written about that you really love to and maybe get published in the future?
Mhm. I love the space race, which I think is so topical right now.
Yeah.
I know we're recording this a little bit before it goes out, but they just announced the Artemis 2 astronauts. So the first astronauts go back to the moon in 50 years, and that's incredible. And I just, we talk about cooperation, especially among engineers and scientists, and I think the idea of space is one of those really incredible times of cooperation. And we're taking a Canadian astronaut on a US really based mission, and because the Canadians have helped. And so I love all the cooperation that goes into it. And in terms of modern day explorers, that's very much very much up the alley of things that I write about. And so I would love to write a space book one day. I think there are a lot of stories there that haven't been told, especially from the earth engineer perspective too.
Yeah.
When I was growing up, Apollo 13 was always my favorite movie, and
Oh,
I
yeah.
thought that was so well done, because not only do you have those astronauts in space, doing all the dramatic astronauty things, but then you come back down to Earth and see how the people are solving the problems, and go through all that problem solving and sciency, uh, you know, and tell that like a story. And I thought that was very well told as a story and not at all boring. So yeah, I'd love to do something with space, and something along the lines of that.
So it's now time, sadly, but also excitedly, because while I am sad that the interview is kind of coming to a close, this is probably the most fun question to ask, and it's the last question of the interview, one that I ask every single person that I've ever interviewed. No pressure. So, if you could be or meet any literary character, and what I mean by literary character is you could be or meet your favorite author, or you could be or meet your favorite character in a book. Or there's no shame in choosing someone from your own stories, though I guess they're not necessarily
Oh,
characters, they're rather real people. So you can maybe
yeah,
say, "Oh, I want to meet Alan Turing." There's no shame in that. So
yeah.
who would it be and why?
Well, and that's the cool thing with Mountain of Fire, which I might always have to say is fire, fire, fire. Now that was really good, E-Train. I really liked those sound effects. And that was a really cool thing about Mountain of Fire, is actually getting to talk to some of those characters and some of the heroes there. But I'm so glad I could prepare a little bit for this question, because I love it and I love hearing everyone's answers. But it did take me a while to think about it. And I think if I was going to if I was going to meet any author, um, that's a harder one. That's a very, very hard question. Probably have to be Madeline L'Engle,
Oh yeah.
who wrote A Wrinkle in Time. I mean, she would be awesome to meet. I would love to have a conversation with her. But if I
It's
was going to be any character, and I had to struggle with this one, because it has to be from a book from when I was like, that I read when your age, excuse me. I still love middle grade novels and middle grade books now, and but as an adult you don't quite feel it the same way. Like there's never going to be that like lightning strike moment, or quite
yeah.
the same way as it was when I was reading them as a middle grade reader. um I think I would love to be, if I had to be a character, I would love to be Will Stanton from The Dark is Rising. Um, I think I think the way he's written to use his powers, to learn about his powers, the kind of team he's assembled with, you know, with this mentor, with other kids his age, and the way that they all rely on one another. Some of the, you know, conflict that comes up in the book, and the history along with it. I think that is so cool. I would love to be Will Stanton. Although there was a second close runner up of, again, so a book that I read, that I don't hear about so much now, and maybe should. So Charlotte Doyle, from The True Confessions of Charlotte Doyle by Avi. And she's this, I think she's 12, and she sails from England to America. I forget what the exact year is. It's probably late 1700s, early 1800s. But she sails on a tall ship. And she's the only kid and the only girl on the whole ship. And there's a murder that takes place, and she learns to sail, and she solves this, you know, she works to solve this murder. And she sounded so cool when I was a kid. I mean, she was just the height of coolness, and this person I would have loved to be. And I couldn't choose her totally, because I think I would just be absolutely terrified if I was really her. Like, I don't think, I think I'd be in real life far too paralyzed with fear to really do much. But she was the height of, you know, she was my hero growing up.
Well, you have such great answers to not just this question, and also Avi writes incredible stories, and I've read quite a few of them and I love them. So
Yeah,
it's a great answer.
yeah,
And all of
yeah.
your answers have been so thoughtful and thought-provoking as well. So thank you just so much for joining me today. Like wholeheartedly. I
Thank you so much,
love
Chase,
this chat.
for having me. Yeah, you know, you do such a wonderful job with reaching out to authors and to other groups with your literacy efforts. Like, this is so great to be a part of your podcast. And thank you for all the research and work you do putting into the questions.
Well, from research to engineering, I've really, really enjoyed our conversation, and I think that everybody who listened or watched or however they viewed it, maybe they found it because my mom posted it on Instagram on her account. However they discovered it, I'm sure that you're all going to be dying to read Race to the Bottom of the Earth, Unbreakable, The Spies Who Cracked the Nazis' Secret Code, and then Mountain of Fire, 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 Fire. So, once again, thank you so much for coming and opening our eyes and our minds to histories many of us never even thought twice about before this interview. So, keep on reading, keep on learning, everybody, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.